First thing you need to know, you don't have to have a guide in Alaska, as I'm sure you guys know already. That's what allows it to be a DIY trip. So you don't need a guide. These tags are predominantly over the counter. There are some draw only areas in Alaska where you have to draw a tag, but there's a lot of area and a lot of country with moose. It's OTC hunt, guys. It's a great opportunity to experience hunting Alaska, but there's a few things you need to know before you go do that. A big thing you need to know is the legality of taking a moose. Every moose hunting area, every unit, subunit has its own regulations determined for moose hunting. So not all areas are the same. There are some areas where you can literally shoot any bull moose. There are some areas where you can only shoot a bull moose with 50-inch antlers, 50-inch wide or wider. Or there's some areas where you can only shoot moose that are 3 brow tines or 50 inches wide or wider, and some areas that are 4 brow tines or 50 inches in wide or wider. And you guys need to know what brow tine is. You need to know what the measurements are for measuring the width of a moose. So those are things that are important when you're DIY hunting. When you're going with a guide, the guide knows all that, and so he can tell you, hey, let's go try to take this moose. So understanding the meat requirements, the meat salvage requirements in the area in which you're hunting. And this generally, guys, is pretty universal. The meat has to stay on the hind quarter. That doesn't change. But for us, what we do is we just require all the meat to stay on the ribs no matter what, because there are some units that change yearly, and then other units, they have always had meat required to stay on the bone. So we just universally say, hey, keep the meat on the bone, be safe. So in Alaska, it's better to play it safe and know than kind of just do what you think is right at the time. So leave the meat on the bone. How much meat is required to come off the animal? They actually have weighed out measurements in the Alaska regulations. That is the average amount of meat in pounds to come off of every animal that you harvest in Alaska. So that meat weighing average that they describe in the regulations can be held against you if you come out of the field with a super light loads of meat, like you're not salvaging enough, and you say, well, that's how all it was. Well, then they say, no, this is actually what the average size moose in the harvest allowance is to come out of the field. So you have to know these things. The meat is very, very important, and everybody takes it very, very seriously. So you need to understand that you're not just going out into the field and shooting a deer, throwing it over your shoulder and hiking back. And you need to understand that if you leave neck meat, you're in serious trouble. You need to understand that if you debone a hind quarter, you're in serious trouble. All these things that we kind of take for granted in the lower 48 when we're shooting elk, just boning things out real quick. You can be in serious, serious trouble if you do that in Alaska. So you need to know that before going in on a hunt like this. The travel is not the same. Alaska miles are different than lower 48 miles. A lot of times when you're moose hunting, you're like, hey, how far did we hike today? Or how far is that? And you go, oh, that's only 4 miles. But then you go walk a half a mile, and there's tussocks and there's swamp, like, tundra stuff that just absorbs your feet and you can't move very well. Or on the other hand, there's nice firm tundra walking and you can go forever. So it's learning the different areas that you're in. If you're on a raft, you're obviously going to try to utilize the raft as part of your hunt and cover ground and hunt based on your raft, but knowing that how far you can go from the river and still effectively bring your moose back to the river in a good amount of time where you can get the meat out, not only to the raft, but then you have to float the meat out. So if you're raft hunting, you not only need to understand your limitations off the river, but you need to understand how long it's going to take you to your next point where you can get picked up and get the meat and trophy out of the field. Getting flown out in super cubs or beavers on floats or any other float plane or bush wheel type plane, whether you're either getting landed on a ridge or you're getting landed on a body of water that you can hunt around, because moose love water. And so you're going to find them in more temperate areas where there's a lot of foliage, where they can not only feed but also hide in the winter, things like that. And they're also not like caribou that just walk for thousands of miles across spanses of barren tundra, into different migration patterns and things like that. Moose are pretty habitual. They stay in the same areas, they rut in the same areas, and they kind of grow up in a very, a general, they have a pretty localized habitat. So in this, when you're hunting specifically off of like ridges, spike camps, and things like that, again, logistics are important to understand. How far away from camp can you effectively bring back the meat to get flown out of? And this is something you have to ask yourself, and everybody's different and every situation is different, because there are some walking and mountains and ridges and lakes and areas, and not all of it's a swamp, and not all of it's bad walking. Some of it is, some of it isn't, and some of it, both of those situations exist right where you're hunting. So you may see a moose 2 miles away in an area where you're like, hey, that's pretty good walking. We can maybe go try to see what that moose is all about, see what that bull is looking like. Or there's a moose a half a mile away in a totally undoable, like terrible walking scenario, terrible hiking. Access is almost impossible. And that's the situation. So it's all relative in what the footing is like. Same thing as hunting off a river in a raft. For the most part, hunting out of a spike camp is pretty effective. A lot of guys will take pack rafts and utilize those if they need to transport, moose parts. We had a couple really good DIY hunters this year, brought a couple pack rafts with them. They don't weigh anything, and they shot a moose pretty far away from camp, but they use those rafts to transport the moose all the way back, because of a series of little streams and creeks and little ponds that they can get back to where their camp was without having to put it on their backs, which would have been pretty much impossible. So outside of pack rafts and hunting from ridges and spike camps and understanding terrain, it's just really important to understand what your physical level is, understanding how much you can pack. Really, you need to understand when you're hunting moose is it's not like calling an elk where they will bugle back at you, or there's a response back. There's an immediate response. Moose very seldomly respond in a way that you can actually hear them from a long ways away. Cows are very, very loud, relatively speaking. Bull moose are very quiet. When they respond to calls, they usually have to be within a half mile or so, or closer depending on the wind of you, so that you can hear them, because our human ears are exponentially smaller and less sensitive than their ears. So when you're calling moose, the biggest tip and tactic is to call from one area. Don't call all day long. Try to mimic the moose. So when you're calling all day, that doesn't really sound like a moose. It doesn't really act like a moose. So you want to kind of represent as best you can the moose patterns. We get so obsessed with what we sound like, when it's actually, a lot of it has to do with how we act. So it's as important to pattern yourself as a moose as it is to sound just like a moose. I learned this early on when I was guiding, when I was trying to figure it out and understand how to get these bulls around and how to call them in and just how to find them. And I learned it after trial and error of calling like I would elk hunting, and you're just running and gunning, calling everywhere, hitting ridges, calling, trying to wait for a response, trying to hear a moose, that's not always the case. Sometimes that can happen, and it has happened, where immediately you get a bull to answer and come and he's right there. But more often than not is that the moose is going to hear you, and then he's going to respond in his time, and his time may be tomorrow or 2 days from now, or in the middle of the night when you're sleeping. I've had many occasions where I call and I don't sound perfect. I'm not the best moose caller, but I call in a pattern that they can respond to. I call in a pattern that allows them to believe that I'm another moose, whether I'm a cow or a bull. And that's typically early in the morning and late in the like last light, first light, or dark, like before the sun's up, dark, and then maybe once or twice in the middle of the day. But I call, and their response may be the next day. And so you always have to be ready and not do this serial calling all over the place, because what you'll actually do is you can confuse these moose. So you guys want to call and make it a spot, because you're going to be hunting out of the same area for 10 days or so. And a good place to call would be a good vantage point. The direction you're calling is in an area where a lot of moose could be living, like in a heavy timbered area against a lake. A lot of bodies of water have heavy timber lined up against them. So you want to call in these areas where these bulls like to be and like to live. You know, you're not going to want to call up to the top of a mountain, towards the top of a mountain. You want to call down into the valley. And when you do locate them, then you can have your go-to points where you're like, hey, if we see something here, we can get down there and continue to coax them, hopefully closer to camp. So you don't want to be, again, too far, too high. You want to be in an area where it's good for calling, good for sound, good to where these bulls are going to, good moose habitat, and that you can repeat it day after day after day and show up there and wait. So that's my biggest tip, and that's how I hunt moose, and I've been very successful at doing that because I've stayed disciplined no matter if I call and nothing happens, even for a day, because what happens is sometimes weather can come in and it'll shift the moose habitat, but these bulls will hear it from 3 miles away, 2 miles away, and they'll come. It may take them 24 to 48 hours, but they will be right where they called. And if you're not there, you're going to miss out. It's not always a giant bull, but I'm telling you, more than once, I've called, and 2 days later, a bull was standing in my footprints of where I was calling from. And we hadn't seen anything until that point. And we had no idea a moose was even around. But a big bull showed up exactly where I called, because that's the pattern in which they operate. They're very habitual, very slow, very methodical creatures that they understand that most of what they do is by sound. That's how they hear wolves and bears, and that's also how they survive, is by sound. So they hear these nuanced little cow calls and bull calls and grunts and stuff. In that time of season, you have to rely on those senses, even when yours don't work as well. You can't hear them, but they can hear you. So that goes into my next kind of suggestion or tip when you're hunting moose, is be quiet. Don't make a lot of noise. Don't do a lot of loud talking. They're very sound sensitive, as I just explained with these calling the moose. They can hear you from miles away. Don't do a lot of laughing, talking, making a ton of noise. It's not going to help you. It's hard to do when you're camping with your buddies and you're in Alaska and you're out in the middle of the bush. You got to stay focused and keep your sound disciplined. And that's going to only help you in getting these bulls and hearing these bulls and getting them convinced that you are something they need to come to, whether you're acting like a cow or a bull or a little bit of both. That you need to convince them that this is a place where there's moose hanging out, and bring them close to your area so you can see them, and then hopefully take them. So that's the main factors, guys, are environment and moose habitat, moose patterns. Just understanding those things before you go on your first DIY moose hunt, meat salvage, and just kind of tactics depending on where you're hunting. I'll go into some more tactics about hunting specifically off a raft later, but I went over the basics for you. Just understanding proximity to your camp and to your raft, wherever you're hunting, and just to get the moose out of the field. Also, how to set yourself up to call correctly, and hopefully have a successful moose hunt. I hope a couple of those tips helped you. I do the best I can to make it understandable, and I hope it helps. I hope you guys go out and get yourself a moose this fall. If you have any questions, hit me up in my links below. We do outfitted drop camps for guys, and they're super fun, super challenging. Just hit me up. If you got any comments, shoot them down below, and I'll try to get to them as best I can. Talk to you later.